Okay, so now that we've talked about how chlorophyll works, let's go back to talking about the process of photosynthesis. Remember, we have the photoreaction, where we're storing energy from the sun, happening in the thylakoids. Then we build new sugars in the synthesis reaction, which happens in the stroma. The goal of the photoreaction is to store energy, and we do that by storing sunlight energy in the bonds of two molecules, ATP and NADPH. You may remember that ATP stores energy in its phosphate groups. NADPH has a different way of storing energy. It does this by accepting high energy electrons. As we talk about the photoreaction, pay attention to how those two molecules are formed. Now let's look at what is happening in the photoreaction. This is a complicated process, so you may want to pause or rewatch this video several times as you figure out what's going on. As we move through, follow the electrons. Watch where they're going, and that will help you understand the process. The first step in the photoreaction is the water-splitting photosystem. The photons in waves of sunlight hit the chlorophyll in the leaves. This causes electrons in chlorophyll to enter an excited or high-energy state. These excited electrons are transferred to the primary electron acceptor, a molecule that carries these excited high-energy electrons along to the next step. But for chlorophyll to continue capturing energy from the sun, those electrons that were lost need to be replaced. The plant gets these replacement electrons by splitting water molecules. When water is split, we get electrons, which go to the chlorophyll, and we're left with some protons and an oxygen molecule. We're going to use those protons in a minute, but the oxygen molecule is a byproduct. So this is the step where the plant releases that extra oxygen. So in that first step, we produce some high-energy electrons. Next, they enter the electron transport chain. In this step, the energy contained in those electrons is used to pump protons into the thylakoid. Remember, those electrons and protons came from the water molecule we just split. This creates a concentration gradient, which is a store of potential energy. We talked about concentration gradients in the very first lecture, but let's refresh. A concentration gradient is when we have a high concentration of a molecule or charge on one side and a low concentration on the other. As those positively charged protons get crammed together in the thylakoid, they push against each other. Given the chance, they'll try to get away from each other. A concentration gradient stores energy just like how holding a ball up in the air stores energy. Once the ball is released, or the protons move back across the thylakoid, that potential energy is transformed into kinetic energy and released. So the protons build up in the thylakoid, storing potential energy, and at some point they rush back out of the thylakoid. When they do this, they release energy that is used to add a phosphate group to ADP, making ATP. So now we have transformed that sunlight energy into potential energy stored in the bonds of ATP. Then, in the final steps of the photoreaction, we also create an energy-storing molecule called NADPH. This step starts similar to the first one, but now we are in a different photosystem. Electrons in the NADPH-producing photosystem are excited by the sunlight and transferred to the primary electron acceptor. Those electrons are going to go off to the next and final step. However, just like before, we need to replace those lost electrons. This time, we don't need to split more water molecules. Instead, we borrow some replacement electrons from that first electron transport chain. The high energy electrons we produced in the NADPH producing photosystem enter the second electron transport chain. They get added to a molecule called NADP+, turning it into NADPH. NADPH is known as a high energy electron carrier because it can hold onto and carry those high energy electrons. Now pause and answer these 3 questions from Participation Assignment 8. So let's pause for a minute and come back to our formula to see where we are in completing the reactions of photosynthesis. So far, we used water and some sunlight energy to create 2 energy-storing molecules, ATP and NADPH. We've also released some oxygen that was created as a byproduct of the photoreaction. We have not yet used any carbon dioxide or produced any sugars. That comes in the synthesis reaction. So now we've stored energy in ATP and NADPH, but we still need to use that energy to build the sugar molecules that will make up new plant tissues. This happens in the synthesis reaction, which is really a series of reactions that together are known as the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle takes place in the stroma of the chloroplast. The Calvin cycle has 3 steps. The first step, fixation, is where carbon dioxide comes into photosynthesis. The carbon in that carbon dioxide is going to be used to build sugars. During fixation, some of that carbon from the carbon dioxide the plant breathes in is added to an organic molecule containing 5 carbon atoms. An enzyme called ribisco is used to facilitate this reaction. So now we have a 6-carbon organic molecule. Next, we are going to use that new organic molecule to build some sugars. To do this, we need to use the energy we stored in ATP and NADPH during the photoreaction. By breaking the bonds in those energy-storing molecules, we release some energy that is used to convert the organic molecule into a small sugar called G3P. We then use that G3P as a building block to build larger, more complex sugars like glucose. So we've made our sugar, but remember this is a cycle that is happening over and over again. So we need a way to reset the cycle so we can start the process again. In the regeneration step of the Calvin cycle, some of the leftover G3P we made gets converted back to that 5-carbon original molecule. To do this, we also need to use a little energy from ATP. Now, that 5-carbon organic molecule is ready to accept carbon from carbon dioxide and repeat the cycle. Photosynthesis is a complex process. So now that you've seen all the steps once, let's go back through them and refresh. First, electrons in the chlorophyll in the water-splitting photosystem are excited by sunlight and delivered to the first electron transport chain. Those lost electrons are replaced by splitting water molecules. Next, the energy of those excited electrons is used to pump protons into the thylakoid, creating a concentration gradient. As those protons leave the thylakoid, they release energy that is used to make ATP. Then we move to the NADPH producing photosystem, where again electrons in chlorophyll are excited by the sunlight, and they get passed to the second electron transport chain. But this time, instead of splitting more water molecules, we borrow some extra electrons from that first electron transport chain. In the second electron transport chain, those excited electrons are used to make NADPH. Now we have the ATP and NADPH we need to complete the Calvin cycle. In the Calvin cycle, we take carbon from carbon dioxide and add it to a 5-carbon organic molecule. Then we use the energy stored in ATP and NADPH to convert that molecule to the sugar G3P, which gets combined to form larger sugars, but some G3P is left over. So we use some more energy from G3P to reform our original organic molecule so we can start the cycle again. So how do plants actually breathe in the carbon dioxide they need for the Calvin cycle? It enters through small openings in the leaves called stomata. However, when stomata are open, some water can evaporate out of them. So plants are able to open and close their stomata to balance taking in carbon dioxide and losing water. Depending on the environment the plant lives in, it may have a high need to conserve water. But the longer the stomata are closed, the less carbon dioxide the plant can take in. Some plants have special adaptations to their photosynthesis process that allow them to maximize intake of carbon dioxide and minimize water loss. Most plants have C3 photosynthesis, which is the process we just talked about. However, plants who live in dry environments have a different form of photosynthesis called C4 photosynthesis. They can partially close their stomata to reduce evaporation, but as a result, they take in less carbon dioxide. So instead, in C4 photosynthesis, there's an extra step that allows these plants to take up more carbon dioxide when their stomata are open. However, there's a cost to this. It takes more energy to perform this extra step. However, it makes them able to survive in dry environments. Plants in extremely dry environments, like deserts, have another form of photosynthesis called CAM photosynthesis. In CAM photosynthesis, plants open their stomata at night when it is cooler and less dry, and close them during the day. To make sure they still have a supply of carbon dioxide for photosynthesis during the day, they have an extra step that allows them to store carbon dioxide so they can use it during the daytime. However, this extra step also takes extra energy and takes more energy than the extra step in C4 photosynthesis. Because it costs them so much energy, they have less energy to put towards growth. So these plants tend to grow very slowly. This is why cacti tend to have very slow growth. Now answer these 2 questions to complete participation assignment 8.